The abandoned bride stood alone at a frozen train station, holding the suitcase she carried across hundreds of miles, until a quiet cowboy stepped through the crowd and offered the one thing she never expected. Evelyn Hartley's hands tightened around her worn leather bag as the cold Montana wind swept across the empty platform. The stagecoach wheels faded into the distance, leaving only whispers behind. Then a cowboy's voice came from the silence. "Miss Hartley, if you have nowhere else to go, come home with me." But why would a lonely rancher offer shelter to a woman he had never met? Stay with us and discover the story. The stagecoach wheels groaned as they rolled to a stop in the middle of Red Hollow, kicking up a thin cloud of dust that drifted across the wooden boardwalk. Evelyn Hartley stepped down carefully, one hand holding the small leather handle of her suitcase and the other keeping her wool coat closed against the sharp Montana wind. She had spent 3 weeks traveling west from Kansas, crossing endless stretches of prairie and rough mountain roads, carrying little more than a few dresses, her family Bible and the letters that had promised her a new beginning. She stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the unfamiliar town. Red Hollow was smaller than she had imagined. A few wooden buildings lined the dirt street. A general store sat beside a small hotel with faded paint on its sign. Smoke curled from the chimney of a nearby diner, carrying the smell of coffee and fresh bread into the cold afternoon air. Horses shifted restlessly near the hitching posts, their breath turning white in the chilly breeze. Evelyn looked toward the road leading out of town. She expected to see him. Mr. Walter Brooks, the rancher from the letters, the man who had written about his land, his cattle, and the quiet life waiting for them beyond the mountains. He had told her he would be standing near the station when the stage arrived. She checked the small folded piece of paper inside her coat pocket again. Red Hollow Stage Station, Tuesday afternoon. "I will be there." She read those words so many times during the journey that she could almost hear his voice, but the road remained empty. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The stage driver climbed down and began unloading supplies and luggage. A few passengers walked away toward waiting relatives and friends. A young couple embraced beside a wagon. An old man laughed as his grandson ran toward him. Everyone seemed to have someone. Everyone except her. Evelyn adjusted her hat and tried not to look worried. Perhaps the ranch was farther away than he expected. Perhaps his horse had gone lame. Perhaps a storm had delayed him. She had learned long ago that a woman like her could not afford to expect too much from people. Hope was a beautiful thing, but it was also something that could leave a bruise when it disappeared. A few townspeople began noticing. A woman standing alone with a suitcase was not unusual in a frontier town, but a woman waiting for someone who never came was. 2 women near the general store glanced in her direction. "Is that the Kansas bride?" one whispered. "I heard she was coming to marry Brooks. Maybe he changed his mind." The words were quiet, but Evelyn heard them. She lowered her eyes and tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. She had heard worse things before. Back home, people had been polite enough most of the time. They smiled. They offered careful words. They said she had a kind heart and a good head for farming. But behind those compliments was always the same unspoken thought. A woman her size should be grateful for any chance she received. Evelyn had spent years pretending those things did not hurt. She picked up her suitcase and moved closer to the station wall, hoping the crowd would lose interest. But the longer she waited, the harder it became to pretend. The sun began sinking behind the distant mountains, painting the sky with faded orange light. The wind moved through the empty street, carrying the sound of swinging signs and creaking wooden fences. The stage driver looked over at her. "Miss, you expecting someone?" Evelyn forced a small smile. "Yes, sir." The driver glanced down the road. "Looks like he may not be coming," she swallowed. "I suppose we'll see." The driver gave a sympathetic nod but said nothing more. He had seen enough people left behind to know when words would only make things worse. Across the street, near the entrance of the Red Hollow Hotel, a man stood beside a dark brown horse. Caleb Mercer had noticed the woman the moment she stepped off the stage. At first, he thought nothing of it. Travelers came through Red Hollow every week. Some stayed. Some moved farther west. Some came searching for work or family or a fresh start. But this was different. He noticed the way she kept looking toward the road, the way she stood straighter every time a wagon passed, the way she held herself together, even as the whole town slowly realized what had happened. Caleb knew that kind of silence. He had lived with it for years. He wore a faded brown coat, worn leather gloves, and a hat that had seen more winters than most men in town. His face carried the marks of long days outside, but his eyes stayed fixed on Evelyn. Beside him, Samuel Price, his ranch hand, followed his gaze. "You know her?" Caleb shook his head. "No." Samuel looked back toward the station. "Then why are you watching?" Caleb did not answer right away. The question bothered him because he did not have a simple answer. He had spent years building a life where nothing was expected from him. The ranch needed him. The cattle needed him. The land needed him. People were harder. People left. People made promises they did not keep. He had learned that lesson too well, but watching Evelyn stand alone with that small suitcase reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. Being abandoned in front of a crowd was a lonely thing. Caleb looked across the street again. The woman was now speaking quietly with the stage driver, asking if there was another hotel in town. Her voice was calm, too calm, like someone trying very hard not to break. Samuel sighed. "Cub." The cowboy looked at him. "Don't." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say anything." "You were going to?" "I was going to say that bringing strangers home usually ends badly." Caleb looked back toward Evelyn. Maybe. Then why? For a moment, the only sound between them was the wind moving through the street. Then Caleb stepped away from the hotel. Samuel watched him walk across the road. "Lord help us," he muttered. Evelyn had just picked up her suitcase when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered, and quiet. His clothes carried the dust of the trail. His expression was serious, but there was no judgment in his eyes. She recognized him as the cowboy who had been watching from across the street. For a moment, she wondered if he had come to tell her something about Walter Brooks. Instead, he removed his hat. "Miss Hartley?" Her heart tightened. "Yes." He hesitated. Just for a second. Then he spoke in a low voice. "Miss Hartley, if you have nowhere else to go, come home with me." The sounds of Red Hollow seemed to fade around her. Evelyn stared at him, unsure if she had heard correctly. A stranger, a cowboy she had never met, offering her a place to stay after the man who promised her a future had left her standing alone. She looked past him toward the mountains in the distance, then back at the rancher waiting quietly in front of her. She did not know his name. She did not know what kind of man he was, and she certainly did not know that the choice she made in that moment would change the course of both their lives. But with the cold wind pressing against her coat and the entire town watching, Evelyn Hartley picked up her suitcase and followed the cowboy. She did not know what else to do. Behind her, Red Hollow's whispers faded beneath the sound of wagon wheels and horse hooves. She kept her eyes forward as she walked beside the stranger, careful not to rush and careful not to appear as uncertain as she felt. The cowboy led her toward a dark bay horse tied near the edge of town. The animal stood quietly, its reins hanging loose, as if it had spent many hours waiting for its owner. The man lifted Evelyn's suitcase and placed it in the back of the wagon. She reached for it. "I can carry my own things." He looked at her hand, then back at her face. "I figured you could." There was no insult in his voice, Only a simple statement. He stepped aside. But you have been carrying enough today. Evelyn did not answer. She climbed into the wagon, folding her hands in her lap as the cowboy mounted the seat beside her. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The road leaving Red Hollow stretched between open fields and tall pine-covered hills. The town grew smaller behind them until the buildings disappeared completely. Only the sound of the wagon wheels pressing into the frozen dirt remained. Evelyn glanced at the man beside her. You know my name, he nodded. Everyone in town knew who you were. A small shadow crossed her face. That does not sound comforting. No, he admitted. It probably isn't. She looked down at her gloves. I suppose you also heard what happened. I heard enough. The wind moved through the valley, pulling at the edges of Evelyn's coat. She expected questions. She expected curiosity. She expected him to ask why a woman would travel so far to marry a man she barely knew, but he did not. That surprised her more than anything. After a while, she finally asked, "Why did you help me?" The cowboy kept his eyes on the road. "My name is Caleb Mercer." She waited, but he offered nothing more. Evelyn looked at him. That does not answer my question. For the first time, she noticed the smallest change in his expression. Not quite a smile. Almost one. No. It doesn't. He adjusted the reins. I saw someone standing alone when everyone else was watching. The answer was simple. Maybe too simple, but somehow Evelyn believed him. The road became steeper as they climbed toward the mountains. The air grew colder, and the trees thickened around them. Snow rested in patches beneath the pines, untouched except for the tracks of passing animals. Evelyn watched the landscape change. Kansas had been wide and open, with endless fields stretching toward the horizon. This place felt different. The mountains surrounded everything, beautiful but unforgiving. After another hour, the wagon passed through a wooden gate marked by a simple iron sign, Mercer Ranch. Beyond the gate stood a long stretch of pasture, a barn with weathered red boards, and a small house sitting near the edge of the forest. It was not the grand ranch she had imagined in the letters from Walter Brooks. There were no painted fences or welcoming lanterns. The place looked like it belonged to a man who spent more time working than living. Caleb stopped the wagon near the porch. Home. Evelyn looked at the house. The word felt strange. She had left Kansas believing she was traveling toward one home. Instead, she had arrived somewhere she never expected. Caleb carried her suitcase inside. The main room was clean but plain. A wooden table sat near the window. A cast-iron stove warmed the room. A few shelves held supplies, tools, and old books. A coffee mug sat beside a stack of papers near the fireplace. There were no signs of another person living there. No second pair of boots. No extra coat hanging by the door. No photographs except one small frame resting on a shelf. Evelyn noticed it but did not stare. Caleb noticed her noticing. "My wife," his voice changed slightly, not colder, just quieter. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." He nodded once. "Thank you." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Caleb walked toward the hallway. "The bedroom is down there. You can use it." Evelyn looked at him. "Where will you sleep?" "Here." He pointed toward the chair near the fireplace. "You cannot sleep in a chair. I have before." She looked at him carefully. There was something in the way he said it. Not pride, not sadness, just a fact. Evelyn placed her gloves on the table. "Mr. Mercer." "Caleb," she paused. "Caleb," he looked back at her. "I appreciate what you have done. Truly. But I do not want to be someone's burden." His expression remained calm. "You are not. You barely know me, that's true." The answer caught her off guard. Most men would have rushed to reassure her. Caleb simply accepted the truth. I don't know you, he continued, and you don't know me. I cannot promise you things I don't know how to give. Evelyn looked toward the window. The mountains outside were already turning dark as evening approached. But I can promise you this, Caleb said. She turned back. You will have a warm room, food on the table, and no one here will make you feel like you have to earn the right to exist. For a moment, Evelyn did not know what to say. She had received many promises in her life, some written carefully in letters, some spoken kindly by people who did not mean harm. But this one felt different because Caleb Mercer was not offering her a dream. He was offering her something quieter, a place to stand. That night, Evelyn unpacked her few belongings into the small bedroom. She placed her Bible on the nightstand. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The ranch had a different kind of silence. Back home, silence meant empty fields and distant farm sounds. Here she heard the wind moving through the trees, the occasional sound of cattle outside, the slow footsteps of a man who had spent years walking through the same rooms alone. When she stepped out later, she found Caleb sitting near the fireplace, looking over ranch records, a candle burned beside him. You should sleep, she said. He looked up. So should you. A small pause passed between them. Then Evelyn noticed the blanket folded beside the chair. You have done this before. Caleb looked at the blanket. Done what? Made yourself uncomfortable so someone else could be comfortable. He looked away. I suppose. She wanted to say more, but she stopped herself. They were strangers, even if they shared the same roof. They were still strangers. The next morning, Evelyn woke before sunrise. She dressed quietly and stepped into the kitchen. The house was cold. She found a small sack of coffee near the stove and prepared a pot. She measured carefully, not wanting to waste anything. When Caleb entered a few minutes later, he stopped near the doorway. Evelyn turned. I hope you don't mind. His eyes moved to the coffee, then to her. I don't. He poured himself a cup. For a while they stood in silence, but this silence felt different. Not empty, just unfamiliar. Outside, the ranch slowly came alive. Horses moved in their stalls. The barn doors opened. A man's voice called from the pasture. Evelyn looked out the window at the land surrounding them. She had arrived in Montana believing her life had fallen apart at a train station. She did not know yet that the lonely ranch she had entered would test everything she believed about love, trust, and belonging. And she did not know that the quiet cowboy beside her had spent years protecting his land, but not his heart. For the first few days at Mercer Ranch, Evelyn Hartley learned the rhythm of a life that moved slower than the one she had known in Kansas. The mornings began before sunrise. The first sound she heard was usually the lowing of cattle beyond the house, followed by the creak of the barn doors opening and Caleb's boots crossing the porch. He never slammed doors, never shouted across the yard unless it was necessary. He moved through the ranch like a man who had memorized every inch of it. Evelyn noticed that before she noticed anything else. The way he checked the fence posts before breakfast. The way he ran a hand along a horse's neck before putting on the saddle. The way he counted supplies twice before leaving for town. Caleb Mercer trusted hard work. People were another matter. Evelyn kept herself busy. She knew better than to sit around waiting for someone to decide what she was worth. She had spent too many years helping her family's farm survive to suddenly become helpless because she had crossed state lines. On her second morning, she'd found a stack of folded blankets that needed mending. She repaired them near the window where the sunlight was strongest. On the third morning, she organized the pantry shelves and wrote down what supplies were running low. On the fourth, she cleaned the kitchen shelves and found several bags of flour stored behind older sacks that had already gone stale. She quietly moved the newer supplies forward. Small things, things that needed doing. She never asked permission, but she never acted as if the ranch belonged to her either. Caleb noticed. He just did not say much. The first ranch hand to meet her was Samuel Price. He was an older cowboy, with gray beginning to show in his beard, and a habit of squinting at everything, as if the world was always trying to fool him. He had worked with Caleb for nearly 10 years, when Evelyn stepped outside carrying a basket of washed linens. Samuel looked at the basket, then at her. "Morning, Miss Hartley." "Good morning, Mr. Price." He nodded. "You planning on staying?" The question was so direct that Evelyn stopped walking. She looked at him. "I believe that is the arrangement." Samuel shifted his weight. "Not many folks are prepared for this country." Evelyn glanced toward the mountains. "I suppose I will find out whether I am." Samuel did not answer. He simply tipped his hat and returned to repairing a section of fence. But Evelyn noticed he watched her carefully. Not cruelly, just cautiously. Everyone in Red Hollow seemed to be waiting for her to fail. She understood why. A woman arriving from another state to marry a stranger was already something people talked about. A woman who arrived and ended up staying with another stranger? That was something they would remember. Later that afternoon, Caleb returned from checking the northern pasture. His coat carried dust from the trail, and there was a small tear near one sleeve. Evelyn noticed it immediately. "Your coat is damaged." Caleb looked down. "It is." "Give it to me." He looked at her. "For what?" "To repair it. I can handle it." She gave him a quiet look. Not offended, just patient. "I am sure you can." Something about the way she said it made him pause. She was not questioning his ability. She was simply offering help. After a moment, he removed the coat and placed it on the table. "Thank you." It was a small thing, but Evelyn noticed. Caleb Mercer was not a man who accepted help easily. That evening, they ate dinner across from each other. The table was large enough for 6 people, but only 2 chairs were used. Evelyn placed her fork down. "Do you always eat in silence?" Caleb looked up. "Usually." "Why?" He considered the question. "I suppose I got used to it." She nodded. She understood more than she wanted to. After dinner, Caleb returned to his ranch records. Evelyn sat near the stove, reading one of the old farming books she had brought from home. Neither of them spoke, but for the first time since arriving, the silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like 2 people learning how to share the same space. A week passed, then another. The people at the ranch slowly began adjusting to Evelyn being there. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Samuel stopped watching her every move. He even began leaving tools closer to where she worked. Knowing she would need them, one afternoon, he found her repairing a torn saddle strap. He stood nearby for a moment. "You know how to do that?" Evelyn looked up. "My father taught me." Samuel nodded. "Most women I have known wouldn't touch leatherwork." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Most women you have known probably had other things to do." Samuel almost smiled. Almost. Then he looked toward the fields. "You and Caleb?" He stopped. Evelyn waited. "What about us?" Samuel scratched his beard. "I don't know." That was the first honest answer anyone in Montana had given her. And strangely, she appreciated it. Because the truth was, she did not know either. She and Caleb shared a home. They shared meals. They shared quiet mornings and long evenings. But they did not share a marriage. Not really. They were 2 people standing on opposite sides of the same room, slowly learning where the other one kept their fears. One night, a strong wind swept down from the mountains. The old barn roof rattled. Evelyn woke and heard movement outside. She stepped into the hallway and saw Caleb pulling on his boots. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." She looked towards the window. "That does not sound like nothing." Caleb hesitated. "The west fence may have come loose. I can help." "No." The answer came too quickly. Evelyn stopped. Caleb seemed to realize how it sounded. He lowered his voice. "It's cold. Stay inside." She nodded, but she noticed something. He was not refusing because he thought she was incapable. He was refusing because he was used to facing every problem alone. When he returned nearly an hour later, his shoulders were covered with frost. Evelyn had left a towel and a fresh cup of coffee near the stove. Caleb looked at the table, then at her. "You waited up? I made coffee." A pause. "Thank you." She nodded. That was all. But later that night, Caleb sat in his chair near the fireplace and looked across the room at Evelyn. For the first time in years, someone had noticed when he was tired. Not because they needed something from him. Not because they expected something from him, just because they cared enough to notice. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Caleb found Evelyn standing beside one of the cattle pens, studying the animals. She had one hand resting on the wooden fence and a notebook tucked under her arm. He walked closer. "What are you doing?" She looked back. "Trying to understand your ranch." "My ranch?" She looked around. "Yes." Caleb studied her. Most people saw the land, the fences, the cattle, the buildings. But Evelyn was looking deeper, at the animals, the fields, the small signs that something was wrong before a problem became serious. Caleb did not know it yet. But the woman everyone in Red Hollow expected to fail was about to show him something he had overlooked for years. And she was about to prove that she had not come west looking for someone to save her. She had come carrying skills, strength, and a life of her own. For the next several days, Evelyn Hartley watched the Mercer Ranch, not from the porch, not from a distance. She watched it the way she had watched her father's farm back in Kansas. The land always spoke before it failed. A broken fence post, a patch of grass that grew differently from the rest of the field, an animal that moved slower than the others. Small things, things many people ignored until they became large problems. Caleb Mercer had built his ranch through years of hard work. He knew his cattle. He knew the mountains. He knew how to survive through harsh winters and dry summers. But even a good rancher could miss something when he carried every responsibility alone. One morning, Evelyn stood near the eastern pasture holding her notebook. The cattle were gathered close to the fence, but something seemed wrong. She watched quietly for several minutes. Caleb rode up on horseback, stopping near the gate. "What are you looking at?" Evelyn looked over. "Your herd." He glanced toward the cattle. "They look fine. They look tired." Caleb narrowed his eyes slightly. "They have been traveling between pastures." She shook her head. "Not all of them." She pointed toward a group near the back. "Those three are staying away from the others." Caleb looked again. This time he paid closer attention. "They were like that yesterday." "Yes, how did you notice?" Evelyn closed her notebook. "Because they were like that yesterday." Caleb said nothing. She walked closer to the fence. "That one has been eating less, and this one keeps favoring her left side." Caleb dismounted and stepped beside her. He studied the animals. For a while, neither spoke. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "What would you do?" It was the first time he had asked her opinion. Not as a courtesy, not because he had no choice, because he wanted to know. Evelyn noticed that. She answered carefully. "I would separate them for a few days. Give them better feed. Keep them somewhere warmer at night." Caleb nodded slowly. That could help. A small breeze moved across the pasture. Evelyn looked at him. "You don't think I am wrong?" Caleb looked surprised by the question. "No." The answer came easily. That surprised her more than anything. For years, Evelyn had grown used to people deciding what she could or could not do before they knew her. But Caleb Mercer was different. He was quiet, sometimes too quiet, but when he listened, he truly listened. By the end of the week, the three cattle had improved. Samuel noticed. He was repairing a wagon wheel outside the barn when Caleb walked by. "You moved those three to the south pasture." "Yes, because Miss Hartley suggested it." Caleb stopped. Samuel looked up. "Don't worry. I am not telling anyone. Telling anyone what? Samuel returned to tightening the wheel. That the woman who came here with a suitcase may know more about ranching than some men who were born around cattle. Caleb gave him a look. Samuel smiled slightly. It is the truth. Caleb continued walking, but the corner of his mouth moved just enough for Samuel to notice. That afternoon, Evelyn found an old fence section near the northern edge of the property. Several posts leaned at uneven angles. She touched one of them. The wood was softer than it should have been. When Caleb returned from town, he found her standing there. What happened? Nothing yet. He looked at the fence. That does not sound like nothing. She smiled faintly. The posts are weakening. If the winter winds come through here, this section will not hold. Caleb walked closer. He pushed against one of the posts. It moved. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. He knew she was right. I missed this. Evelyn looked at him. You have a lot to watch. He glanced across the land. Still should have seen it. She shook her head. My father used to say a farmer's biggest mistake is believing the land will wait for him. Caleb looked at her. Your father taught you well. The words were simple, but Evelyn felt them, because they were not spoken like a compliment given out of politeness. They were spoken with respect. That evening, the two of them worked together repairing the fence. The sun dropped behind the mountains as they carried tools back toward the barn. Caleb held the lantern while Evelyn gathered the loose nails and wire. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people working toward the same thing. Later, while organizing some papers in the house, Evelyn found an old receipt tucked inside one of Caleb's ranch books. It was dated several years earlier. She did not read the details. She only noticed the careful handwriting and the way the paper had been folded many times. When Caleb entered, he saw the receipt in her hand. She immediately placed it back. I am sorry. I was not looking through your things. He paused. I know, the answer was quiet. She looked at him. You do? Caleb nodded. You would have put it back differently if you were. For a moment, Evelyn almost laughed. It was the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him. Then his expression softened slightly. I keep things where I remember them, I noticed. He looked toward the shelf. Most people don't. Evelyn looked at the old papers. Most people probably don't know what they mean to you. Caleb became still. The room grew quiet. She wondered if she had said too much, but after a moment he simply walked to the table and sat down. No, that was all he said. But it was enough, because Evelyn realized something. Caleb Mercer was not a cold man. He was a man who had spent so long protecting what he loved that he no longer knew how to let anyone stand beside him. The next morning, Samuel arrived at the house carrying a box of supplies from Red Hollow. He placed it on the porch. Miss Hartley, yes? He looked slightly uncomfortable. Clara at the general store sent these. Evelyn opened the box. Inside were several jars of preserves, a fresh bar of soap, and a small bag of coffee. Why? Samuel shrugged. She said every woman needs a few things that make a house feel less like a bunkhouse. Evelyn smiled. It was the first kindness from someone in town she had received since arriving. But before she could answer, Samuel added something else. She also said people are talking. The smile faded. About me? Samuel looked toward the mountains. About Caleb? Evelyn waited. Folks don't understand why he brought you here. She lowered her eyes. And what do they think? Samuel hesitated. That a man like Caleb Mercer doesn't do anything without a reason. The words stayed with her because she wondered the same thing. Why had he done it? Why had a lonely cowboy opened his door to a woman he barely knew? She looked across the ranch toward Caleb, who was standing near the barn, checking equipment before the afternoon work began. At that moment, he looked back. Their eyes met. Neither moved, neither spoke. Then Caleb gave a small nod, a simple greeting, a quiet sign that she belonged there, at least for that moment. Evelyn nodded back. She did not know what the future held. She did not know that the town would soon turn against her. She did not know that Caleb's silence would one day hurt her more than any cruel word from a stranger. But she knew one thing. For the first time since leaving Kansas, someone had looked at her and seen more than what others noticed first. And Caleb Mercer was beginning to see the same thing. The woman who arrived unwanted might be the one person who could help save everything he had built. But Red Hollow was not as quick to accept what Caleb had begun to notice. Frontier towns had long memories. A stranger could arrive with a clean coat, a full wallet, and a good name. But people still watched. They measured every word. They remembered every mistake. And Evelyn Hartley had arrived carrying a story the town had already decided to believe. By the beginning of her second month at Mercer Ranch, the whispers had spread beyond the train station and the general store. They followed her into town. They followed her down the wooden sidewalks. They followed her whenever she stepped inside the small places where people gathered for coffee, supplies, and conversation. One Saturday morning, Evelyn rode into Red Hollow with Caleb to purchase winter supplies. The wagon rolled slowly along this dirt road, passing ranch fences and small farms scattered across the valley. Caleb drove quietly. He always did. Evelyn sat beside him, holding a list she had prepared the night before. Flour, salt, lamp oil, horse medicine, extra blankets. Caleb glanced at the paper. "You made a list." She looked over. "Is that surprising?" "No." A pause. "Actually, yes." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He looked back at the road. "Most people just remember what they need." Evelyn folded the paper. "Most people also forget things." A faint smile crossed his face. It disappeared quickly, but she saw it. At the general store, Clara Bennett greeted them warmly. Clara was a woman in her 40s who owned the store after her husband passed away. She had a calm voice and kind eyes, and she never looked at Evelyn with the curiosity everyone else seemed to carry. "Morning, Evelyn. Morning, Clara." Clara placed a few items on the counter. "I set aside some extra buttons. Thought you might need them." Evelyn smiled. "Thank you." Caleb stood nearby, checking prices written on small cards beside the shelves. For a moment, it felt almost ordinary, almost. Then the door opened. The conversation inside the store shifted. Thomas Grady walked in. He was a wealthy cattle owner who dressed differently from most men in Red Hollow. His coat was expensive. His boots were polished. His horse outside had a fine saddle that likely cost more than some families earned in a month. People noticed him. They always did. Thomas removed his gloves and looked around the store. Then his eyes settled on Evelyn. "Mrs. Mercer." The way he said it made the words sound less like a greeting and more like a question. Evelyn turned. "Mr. Grady," he smiled, a polite smile, the kind that did not reach his eyes. "I hear you are settling in." "I am." "That is good." He looked toward Caleb, "though I imagine ranch life is quite different from what you expected." Caleb's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. Evelyn noticed. "We are managing well." Thomas nodded. "I'm sure you are." Then he looked back at the other customers in the store. "Though I suppose some people find ways to make things work when they have limited choices." The room became quiet. Clara stopped arranging jars on the shelf. Evelyn understood exactly what he was doing. He was not insulting her directly. He was doing something worse. He was saying enough for everyone else to understand. Caleb stepped forward. "Thomas," the single word carried a warning. Thomas raised his hand slightly. "I meant no offense." "Then don't speak like you did." For a moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Thomas smiled. Of course, he turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced back. Enjoy your supplies, Caleb. The door closed behind him. The store remained silent for several seconds. Evelyn looked down at the receipt Clara had placed on the counter, her hands folded neatly over it. She did not want anyone to see that the words had reached her. But Caleb saw. On the ride home, the silence between them was different. He held the reins tightly, too tightly. Evelyn looked at him. You were angry? No. She looked at his hands. His knuckles were tense around the leather. Caleb, he loosened his grip. After a moment he said, I don't like people talking about things they know nothing about. She looked away. But they are talking. He did not answer. The wagon continued through the valley. The mountains stood ahead, dark and quiet. That evening, the ranch felt colder than usual. Evelyn prepared dinner. She set 2 plates on the table. Caleb sat across from her, but his thoughts seemed somewhere else. You should have said something. He looked up. About what? In town. His expression tightened. Evelyn, I know you defended me. A pause. But you stopped there. Caleb leaned back slightly. What else was I supposed to do? She looked at him. Tell them they were wrong. His eyes lowered. I don't care what they think. Maybe you don't. Her voice stayed calm. But I do. The words surprised him. Evelyn looked down at her plate. I left my home because I believed someone wanted me there. She swallowed. I arrived here and learned I was wrong. Caleb watched her carefully. You are not unwanted here. She looked up. Then why does it feel like I am still waiting for someone to decide? He had no answer. Because the truth was, Caleb had never thought about how his silence affected her. He had spent years believing silence kept problems away. But Evelyn was not a problem. She was a person. The next morning, Evelyn woke early and went outside before Caleb came in from the barn. She needed air. The valley was covered in a thin layer of frost. The ranch looked beautiful, but beauty did not make loneliness disappear. She walked toward the fence line, checking the repairs they had made together. Then she heard voices near the road. 2 ranchers passing by. They did not see her. That's the woman from Kansas, isn't it? Yes. Poor thing. A pause. Or maybe she knows exactly what she is doing. Evelyn stopped. The words were quiet, but they landed heavily. She returned to the house before they noticed her. Later that day, Caleb found her folding clothes in her room, not packing, just folding. But something about the careful way she moved made him stop at the doorway. You going somewhere? She looked back. No. A moment passed, then she asked, Would you miss me if I did? The question caught him completely off guard. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came, and Evelyn saw the answer before he spoke. Not because he did not care, because he had never allowed himself to imagine losing her. She turned back toward the dresser. I understand. Caleb stood there quietly. For the first time since she arrived, he realized something. Offering someone shelter was not the same as giving them a home. And if he wanted Evelyn to believe she belonged at Mercer Ranch, he could not keep standing silent while the whole world told her otherwise. Caleb Mercer understood cattle. He understood storms. He understood the way a horse shifted its weight before danger came. But he did not understand the quiet hurt in a woman who had traveled across half the country, believing she was finally going somewhere she was wanted. For the next several days, Caleb tried in his own way. He fixed the loose hinge on the kitchen door that had bothered Evelyn since she arrived. He left fresh firewood stacked beside the porch before she woke. He brought home a small bag of coffee beans from Clara Bennett's store because he had noticed Evelyn always measured her morning coffee carefully, never taking more than she needed. He never mentioned any of it. That was Caleb's way. Words had never come easily, actions were safer. Evelyn noticed. She noticed everything, but she did not know what to do with kindness that arrived quietly, so she accepted it quietly too. The two of them began finding a rhythm, not a marriage like the ones Evelyn had imagined from the letters she received in Kansas. Not yet. But something steadier than strangers. They worked together, they ate together, sometimes they even laughed. Usually because Samuel Price said something that neither of them expected. Samuel had changed his opinion about Evelyn. At first, he had watched her like he expected her to complain after one hard day on the ranch, but she never did. She learned the names of the horses. She remembered which cow favored its left side. She repaired a torn work glove of his one afternoon and left it beside his saddle without saying anything. The old ranch hand found it before leaving for the pasture. He held it in his hands for a moment. Then he looked toward the house. Well, he muttered to himself, guess she ain't made of glass after all. But peace in the Bitterroot Valley never lasted forever. The storm came 3 days later. It arrived in the afternoon sky as a dark line beyond the mountains. Caleb saw it first. He stood near the barn, one hand resting on the wooden fence post, watching the clouds gather. The wind had changed. The animals knew it too. Horses shifted in their stalls. Cattle moved closer together. Samuel walked up beside him. That one looks mean. Caleb nodded. We need to bring the herd closer before sundown. The first drops hit the ground before they finished saddling the horses. By evening, the rain had turned into heavy snow, the kind that covered tracks within minutes. The ranch disappeared beneath gray skies and white fields. Inside the house, the fire struggled against the cold. Evelyn stood near the window, watching the snow whip across the valley. How long will it last? Caleb looked outside. Hard to say. You think the cattle are safe? He hesitated. That was enough of an answer. Evelyn grabbed her coat. Caleb turned. No. She stopped. No, you stay here. Her eyebrows lifted. Clip. The roads are dangerous. So are the cattle left out in that weather. His jaw tightened. Evelyn. She stepped closer. You need help. I can handle it. The words came quickly. Too quickly. The same words he had used his whole life. I can handle it. I don't need anyone. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her gloves. I'm not asking permission to care about this ranch. Caleb stared at her. For a second, neither of them moved. Then something unexpected happened. A small smile appeared on his face. Not much, just enough. You're stubborn. She pulled on her coat. So I've been told. A few minutes later, they walked into the storm together. The cold cut through their clothing. Snow gathered on their shoulders. The barn doors shook in the wind as they worked to secure them. Caleb moved from stall to stall, checking the animals. Evelyn followed with lantern in hand. At one point, they found a young calf separated from the herd. Caleb moved toward it. The ground beneath him shifted. Evelyn, stay back! But she was already there. She held the lantern high, guiding him through the blowing snow. Together, they managed to bring the calf safely inside. When they returned to the barn, both of them were breathing hard. Snow covered Evelyn's hair. Caleb looked at her. Not as someone he needed to protect. Not as someone who had been left behind at a train station. He looked at her as someone standing beside him. A partner. The thought stayed with him. Later that night, after the worst of the storm passed, they sat near the kitchen stove, their coats hung dripping by the door. 2 cups of coffee rested between them. Neither spoke for several minutes. The house was quiet, not empty. Quiet. There was a difference. Finally, Evelyn said, "You were married." Caleb looked down at his cup. Yes. She waited. She did not push. That was what made him answer. Her name was Rebecca. The fire cracked softly. She was kind. A small smile touched his face. The kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers. and make them feel welcome. Evelyn listened. What happened? Caleb was silent, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Winter storm." His fingers tightened around the mug. Years ago, there was a bad one. Worse than this. Evelyn watched his face. We were bringing supplies back from town. The weather turned faster than expected. He stopped. The room seemed smaller. I made a choice. What choice? Caleb looked toward the window. I thought I knew the safest way home. His voice lowered. I was wrong. Evelyn did not speak. She never blamed me. A pause. But I did. The words sat between them, heavy, honest. For years, Caleb had carried that memory like a stone in his pocket. Every morning, every night, every quiet moment. Evelyn slowly placed her hand near his on the table, not grabbing it, not forcing anything. Just there. Caleb looked at her hand, then at her face. She said softly, "You survived something painful." He looked away. I should have done more. You loved her. His eyes returned to hers. And you lost her. The fire continued burning. Outside, the storm moved farther into the mountains. For the first time in years, Caleb spoke about Rebecca without closing the door afterward. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, Evelyn saw the man beneath the silence. Not the cowboy everyone respected, not the ranch owner everyone feared. Just Caleb. A man who had been carrying his grief alone for too long. The next morning, the valley woke beneath a blanket of snow. The storm had passed, but something inside Mercer Ranch had shifted. Caleb stepped outside and found Evelyn already repairing a broken fence section near the barn. He watched her for a moment, then he walked over and picked up a hammer. She looked at him. "You helping?" He glanced at the fence. "Looks like it needs fixing." A small smile appeared on her face. "That wasn't what I asked." Caleb looked at her. Then quietly he said, "Yes," and for the first time Evelyn heard him say something he had rarely given anyone. Not a promise, not an explanation, just a simple answer. He was choosing to stand beside her, and somehow that meant more to Evelyn Hartley than any grand promise could have. For several weeks after the storm, Mercer Ranch felt different. Not easier, not perfect, but different. The snow began melting from the lower fields, revealing patches of brown grass beneath the white. The creeks started running again, carrying pieces of ice downstream toward the valley. Every morning, the mountains stood quiet in the distance, their peaks still covered with winter. Evelyn settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She woke before sunrise. She checked the kitchen stove. She wrote notes about supplies that needed replacing. She kept a small ledger beside the pantry where she recorded feed costs, repairs, and deliveries from Red Hollow. Caleb noticed. At first he pretended not to. But he noticed. He noticed the way she folded blankets neatly over the back of the chair every evening. He noticed the way she saved old receipts instead of throwing them away. He noticed that the ranch had fewer problems because someone was paying attention to the little things. One morning, Caleb walked into the kitchen and found Evelyn studying a piece of paper. "What is that?" She looked up. "A bill from the feed supplier." He removed his hat and placed it on the table. "And," she hesitated, "the price went up again." Caleb frowned. "By how much?" She slid the paper toward him. He looked at the numbers. His expression changed. Evelyn watched quietly. She knew that look. It was the look of a man trying to solve a problem before anyone else even knew there was one. "We can manage," Caleb said. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "Maybe." That answer made him look back at her. "Maybe?" She folded the paper carefully. "Caleb, this ranch has good land, good cattle, good water." She paused. "But there are people who know that." He understood immediately, because everyone in Red Hollow knew about the mountain spring. A small stream ran through Mercer land, coming down from the higher slopes. For years, Caleb had used it to water his cattle. It was one reason his ranch survived when others struggled. And it was exactly why Thomas Grady wanted it. Thomas owned the largest cattle operation near Red Hollow. Red Hollow Ranch. Hundreds of acres, more money than most people in the territory would see in a lifetime. But his land sat farther from the mountain water, and Thomas Grady had never been the kind of man who accepted having less. 2 days later, Caleb returned from town with a letter in his coat pocket. Evelyn knew something was wrong before he said anything. He placed the envelope on the kitchen table. The paper was thick. Official. She wiped her hands and looked at him. What happened? Caleb remained standing. Grady's lawyer sent a notice. Evelyn opened the envelope carefully. She read the words. Then she looked up. They're challenging your land claim? Caleb nodded. They say the original boundary records are unclear, but you've owned this ranch for years, I know. His voice was calm. Too calm. Evelyn recognized it. It was the same voice he used when he was trying to carry something alone. Caleb, I'm handling it. She looked at him. How? He did not answer right away. That was answer enough. The next morning, he rode into town alone. Red Hollow was already talking. It seemed every corner had a new rumor waiting. At the general store, Thomas Grady stood near the counter with 2 other ranchers. He smiled when Caleb entered. Mercer. Caleb stopped. Grady. Thomas adjusted his expensive coat. I hear you're having trouble proving what's yours. Caleb said nothing. Thomas leaned closer. Would be a shame to lose that mountain water. A few people nearby went quiet. Caleb looked at him. You know that land belongs to me. Thomas smiled. Knowing something and proving something are different matters. Caleb walked away, but Thomas was not finished. Later that afternoon, Clara Bennett saw Evelyn outside the store. She approached carefully. Evelyn. Evelyn turned. Clara, the store owner, lowered her voice. I wanted you to hear this from someone who respects you. Evelyn waited. Thomas Grady has been asking questions about Mercer Ranch for months. Evelyn's expression changed. What kind of questions about the water? The boundaries. Caleb's finances. Clara glanced toward the street. He isn't just looking for land. The words stayed with Evelyn. That evening, Caleb returned after dark. His boots were covered in mud. His shoulders looked heavier than when he left. Evelyn placed a plate of food on the table. You should eat. I'm not hungry. She looked at him. Caleb. He sat down slowly. I need to deal with this. We need to deal with this. His eyes lifted. The room went quiet. Evelyn, she waited. You don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore. Something changed in his face. Not anger, not exactly. Fear. A fear he did not know how to admit. I can't put this on you. She frowned slightly. Put what on me? The problems, the risk, the uncertainty. Evelyn stepped closer. Caleb, I came here because I thought I was going to marry a stranger. She looked around the small kitchen. Instead, I found a home. His jaw tightened. You don't understand. Then help me understand. He looked away. I lost someone before, because I thought I could protect everything. Evelyn became still, and now, he stood. Now I know better. But his actions said something else. The following week, he spent every waking hour studying documents, meeting with lawyers, and writing property lines. He stopped asking Evelyn for her opinion. He stopped sharing details. The distance returned, slowly, quietly, like winter frost creeping over a window. Samuel noticed first. One evening, while repairing a saddle near the barn, he shook his head. That man is good at fighting storms. Evelyn looked over. But not people? Samuel gave a small sigh. Not the ones he cares about. She looked toward the house. The lights were still on. Caleb was inside, alone. And for the first time since arriving at Mercer Ranch, Evelyn wondered if she had mistaken being needed for being loved. The thought hurt more than she expected, because she had not come west searching for someone to rescue her. She had come hoping to finally stand beside someone. But Caleb kept stepping in front of her, and no matter how much she cared for him, she could not spend her life trying to convince a man to let her stay. The decision did not come in one moment. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no angry words echoing through the house. That was what made it harder. Evelyn Hartley had learned that some wounds were not made by cruel words. Some were made by silence. The weeks after Thomas Grady's challenge became the longest Evelyn had known since arriving in Montana. Every morning, Caleb left before breakfast. His coffee sat untouched on the kitchen table more often than not. His coat was always hanging by the door before sunrise. His boots carried the same dust and mud back into the house every evening. And every night, Evelyn watched him spread documents across the table, studying maps and old records by lamplight until his eyes grew tired. She wanted to help. She tried. Once she brought him a folder containing notes she had made about the ranch expenses. "I thought this might help," she said. Caleb looked up. For a brief second, she saw appreciation in his eyes. Then he looked back at the papers. "I'll handle it." The words were not harsh. That almost made them worse. Evelyn slowly placed the folder on the table. "I know you can." Caleb looked at her. "Then why?" "Because I don't want to watch you do everything alone." The room became still. For a moment she thought he understood. But then Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Evelyn, this is not your fight." She stood there quietly, not angry, not crying, just listening to the distance growing between them. "I see." Caleb immediately noticed the change in her voice. "Evelyn," but she shook her head. "No, it's all right." She turned away before he could see how much those simple words had taken from her. This was not the first time someone had decided she was too much trouble. Back in Kansas, she had spent years proving she was useful. She worked until her hands hurt. She carried more than people knew. She learned early that kindness from others often came with conditions. She had hoped Mercer Ranch would be different, and in many ways, it was. Caleb had given her shelter, respect, a place at his table, but a home was more than a roof. A marriage was more than being allowed to stay, and Evelyn was beginning to understand that being needed was not the same as being chosen. One afternoon, she rode into Red Hollow with Clara Bennett. The general store was quiet. A few farmers stood near the stove drinking coffee and discussing the weather. Clara noticed Evelyn had been unusually quiet. "You don't have to tell me anything," Clara said, while organizing a shelf of canned goods. Ev looked over. "But," Clara smiled faintly, "but I've lived in this town long enough to know when someone is carrying something heavy." Evelyn looked down at the wooden floor. "Caleb is a good man, I know. He has been kind to me, I know that too." Evelyn touched the edge of a folded receipt in her hand. "I just don't know if he wants a wife, or if he only needed someone to help save a ranch." Clara stopped moving, then she quietly placed the box in her hands aside. "Evelyn," she looked up. "You know something most people in this town don't." "What?" "Caleb Mercer doesn't push people away because he doesn't care." Clara paused. "He pushes people away because he cares too much and doesn't know what to do with it." Evelyn gave a small, sad smile. "That may be true." She looked toward the window. "But I can't spend my life waiting for him to figure that out." That evening, Caleb returned later than usual. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains. The kitchen was dark except for one lamp. He stepped inside. "Evelyn?" No answer. He walked farther. The table was clean. The dishes were put away. The small vase near the window, the one she had filled with wildflowers weeks earlier, was empty. Something felt wrong. Then he saw the note. It was beside the coffee tin. His name was written on the outside. Caleb stood there for several seconds before opening it. The handwriting was steady. That surprised him, because Evelyn was not leaving in anger. She was leaving with dignity. She thanked him for giving her a place when she had nowhere else to go. She thanked him for treating her with respect when others had not. She wrote that she would always be grateful for Mercer Ranch, but she could not stay somewhere she was constantly reminded that she was only a guest. Caleb read the words twice, then a third time. The house was silent. Not the peaceful silence they had shared after the storm, a different kind, the kind that made a person notice every sound that was missing. No footsteps in the kitchen, no quiet humming while she worked, no questions about whether the horses had enough feed, no extra cup beside his own. Caleb walked to the bedroom. Her things were gone. The small suitcase she had carried from Kansas was no longer beside the wall. The blanket she kept folded at the end of the bed was gone. Only a few things remained. A book, a hair ribbon, a small jar of dried flowers from the Kansas farm she had once called home. Caleb picked up the jar. He remembered seeing it when she first arrived. He had thought it was just an old decoration. Now he understood. It was a piece of where she came from, something she carried because she had already lost enough. The next morning, Samuel found Caleb standing near the barn before sunrise. The ranch owner had not slept. "You look like you fought the whole mountain," Samuel said. Caleb stared toward the road. "She left." Samuel removed his hat. For once, he had no quick answer. "Where? I don't know." The old ranch hand looked at him carefully. "You let her go?" Caleb said nothing. Samuel sighed. "Caleb," the cowboy looked over. "She wasn't trying to take your ranch, I know. She wasn't trying to replace your past. I know." Samuel stepped closer. "Then what were you afraid of?" Caleb looked away. The question stayed with him, because for the first time he realized Thomas Grady had not been the only person threatening what mattered to him. He had been doing it himself, by keeping Evelyn outside the walls he built around his heart, by deciding for her what she could handle, by protecting himself from losing someone again. That afternoon, Caleb rode into town. He checked the boarding house, the general store, the stagecoach office. Nothing. No sign of Evelyn. When he returned to the ranch, the empty house greeted him again. The legal papers were still on the table. The maps were still spread out. The fight for the land was still waiting. But for the first time, Caleb understood something far more important. A man could lose property. He could lose money. He could even lose a battle. But losing the person who made a place feel like home, that was a loss he could not measure. And somewhere beyond the mountains, Evelyn Hartley was carrying the one thing Caleb did not know he needed, the truth. The small boarding house in the town of Willow Creek was nothing like Mercer Ranch. There were no wide fields stretching toward the mountains. No sound of cattle moving through the morning mist. No old wooden fence lines waiting to be repaired. Just a narrow room above a bakery, a small window facing the main street, and the sound of wagon wheels passing below. Evelyn had taken the room 2 days after leaving Red Hollow. She paid for it with money she had saved from her time at the ranch and helped the boarding house owner with meals and bookkeeping in exchange for a little extra work. It was not the life she imagined when she left Kansas. It was not the life she hoped for when she arrived in Montana. But it was hers. Every morning she woke before sunrise. She made coffee in a small tin pot. She opened the curtains, and she reminded herself that a woman did not need to disappear just because someone failed to see her. Still, there were moments when her mind returned to Mercer Ranch. The kitchen table, the sound of Caleb's boots near the door, the way he always checked the barn before eating breakfast. The quiet moments when neither of them needed to say anything. Those memories were the hardest, because Evelyn had not left because she stopped caring. She left because she cared too much to stay somewhere she felt invisible. Back at Mercer Ranch, Caleb was learning what silence truly meant. Before Evelyn came, he had believed silence was peace. Now he understood the difference. A quiet house could still feel empty. For days, he searched for answers. He studied the old land records. He rode the property lines. He met with a lawyer in Red Hollow who helped him understand Thomas Grady's challenge. But every conversation ended the same way. The old boundary documents were incomplete. Without stronger proof, Grady had a chance to claim part of the mountain water rights. Caleb returned home each evening and sat at the same kitchen table where Evelyn once organized ranch supplies. That was where he found the notebook. It was pushed behind a stack of old receipts near the corner of the table. At first, he thought it was one of his own records. Then he saw the handwriting. Evelyn, he opened it carefully. The first pages were simple. Lists, feed measurements, fence repairs, winter supply estimates, nothing personal, nothing accusing. Then he reached the later pages, and he stopped. She had drawn maps, not complicated ones, just careful notes showing where the cattle were struggling, where the fences needed reinforcement, and where water flow changed during different seasons. Caleb turned the page. There were notes about the northern pasture, another page about the barn roof, another about expenses. Then he saw something that made him sit back. A date. 3 months earlier, before Evelyn had even arrived, she had written, "Damage near eastern fence does not appear natural. Check who benefits from the loss." Caleb stared at the words. He kept reading. Evelyn had noticed missing sections of fence, animals getting through areas they normally avoided. That arrived short, small problems that seemed unrelated, until she connected them. At the bottom of the page was one more note. Someone wants the ranch to look weaker than it is. Caleb closed his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing, because suddenly he remembered. The broken fence posts, the unusual cattle movements, the missing feed shipment, things he had blamed on bad weather, bad luck, old age. But Evelyn had seen what he missed, not because she knew more than him, because she was looking. The next morning, Samuel found him sitting at the table. The notebook was open in front of him. "What did you find?" Caleb pushed the pages toward him. Samuel read quietly. His expression changed. "She figured this out?" Caleb nodded. Samuel looked through several pages. Then he slowly closed the notebook. "Caleb." The cowboy looked up. "You owe that woman more than an apology." Caleb looked down. "I know." "No." Samuel shook his head. "You don't." He pointed toward the notebook. "That woman came here with nothing but a suitcase. People laughed at her. They judged her before they knew her." His voice softened, and she spent her time trying to protect the place that was supposed to be protecting her. Caleb had no answer, because every word was true. Later that afternoon, Caleb rode into Red Hollow. He went straight to Clara Bennett's store. She looked up when he entered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara quietly said, "You found something." Caleb nodded. "Where is she?" Clara placed a box of supplies on the counter. "Caleb, please." The word surprised her, not because he said it loudly, because Caleb Mercer was not a man who asked for anything. Clara studied his face. "She went west. How far?" "I don't know exactly." A pause. "But I know she was looking for a place where she could work." Caleb lowered his eyes. Clara folded her hands. "You hurt her. I know. Not because you were cruel." Caleb looked up. "Because you wouldn't let her stand beside you." The words landed harder than any accusation. Because they were true. Clara reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small envelope. "She left this behind." Caleb took it. Inside was a receipt from the boarding house in Willow Creek. A small piece of paper, an address. For a few seconds, he simply held it. Then he looked toward the door. "I need to find her." Clara nodded. "Yes." The ride to Willow Creek took nearly 2 days. Caleb pushed himself harder than he had in years, not because he was chasing someone, because he was finally going toward someone. When he arrived, the town was quiet. A bakery stood near the corner. A boarding house sign moved gently in the afternoon wind. Caleb stepped inside. The woman at the front desk looked up. "Can I help you?" He removed his hat. "I'm looking for Evelyn Hartley." The woman studied him. Then she glanced toward the stairs. "Room 3. Caleb walked up slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. He stopped outside the door. For the first time in a long while, Caleb Mercer felt uncertain. Not about land, not about a legal fight, not about a storm, about a woman. He raised his hand, knocked. The door opened. Evelyn stood there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She looked at him. He looked at her, and between them stood everything they had left unsaid. Finally, Caleb held out the notebook. "I found this." Her expression changed slightly. "You read it?" He nodded. "I should have listened sooner." Evelyn looked away. "Club?" "No." His voice was quiet. "I came here because I need to tell you something." She waited. He took a breath. "The ranch was never the only thing I was trying to protect." A pause. "It was easier to fight for land than to admit I was afraid of losing someone again." Evelyn's eyes softened, but she did not move closer. Not yet, because the truth had finally reached him, but she needed to know if he was ready to live by it. Evelyn Hartley stood in the doorway of the small boarding house room, one hand resting against the wooden frame. For weeks, she had imagined what she would say if Caleb ever came looking for her. She imagined anger. She imagined telling him how lonely she had felt. She imagined walking away without giving him another chance. But now that he was standing in front of her, covered in dust from the long ride west, with tired eyes and a look she had never seen before, she found herself with fewer words than expected. Caleb held the notebook between them, not as proof, not as an argument, almost like an apology. "I was wrong," he said. The words were quiet, simple, but coming from Caleb Mercer, they carried weight. Evelyn looked down. "I know you were trying to protect the ranch." He nodded. "I was," a pause, "but I was also protecting myself." The hallway behind him was quiet. The sounds of the town drifted through the open window downstairs. A horse moving against a hitching post, a wagon rolling over uneven boards, someone laughing outside near the bakery. Life continuing. Caleb looked at her. "I spent years thinking needing someone made a man weak." Evelyn stayed silent. "And then you came to the ranch with a suitcase and a broken promise from someone else." His voice tightened slightly. "You had every reason to be angry at the world." He looked toward the floor. "But you weren't." She lowered her eyes. "You gave me a chance before I gave you one." That was the first thing Caleb said that reached her. Because it was true. When she arrived in Red Hollow, everyone had already decided who she was. The abandoned bride, the woman who had been rejected, the person who did not belong. But Caleb had looked at her differently, even if he had not known how to let her stay. "I never wanted to take over your life," Evelyn said. Caleb looked back at her. "I know. I never wanted your ranch. I know. I only wanted to be beside you." The silence after those words was long. Caleb swallowed. "I know that now." Evelyn looked away. "And what happens when things get difficult again?" The question stopped him because there was no easy answer. She continued. "When the next storm comes, when another problem appears, when someone threatens what you built." She looked directly at him. "Will you shut me out again?" Caleb did not answer immediately. That mattered. Before, he would have rushed to say something that ended the conversation, something that made the problem disappear. but he stood there and allowed the question to remain. Finally, he said, "No." Evelyn watched him carefully. "I can't promise I won't be afraid." A small breath escaped her. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes." He stepped closer. "But I can promise I won't decide for you what you can handle." The words settled between them. Not perfect, not a grand declaration, something better, something honest. Evelyn looked at the man who had once offered her a home without knowing how to share it. Now he was standing there asking her to return, not as someone he rescued, as someone he respected. "I need time," she said. Caleb nodded. "I understand." The answer surprised her. "You do?" "Yes." He looked around the small room. "I spent too long asking you to understand me." A pause. "It's my turn." For the next several days, Caleb stayed in Willow Creek. He did not pressure her. He did not ask her to pack her things. He did not tell her how much the ranch needed her. Instead, he helped. He fixed a broken fence behind the boarding house. He carried sacks of flour for the bakery. He repaired a loose wagon wheel for the owner. Evelyn watched, not because she needed proof that he could work. She already knew that. She was watching for something else. Patience, humility, a willingness to stand beside her without trying to lead her. One evening, they walked along the edge of town. The sun was low over the hills. The air smelled like pine and fresh earth. "You've changed," Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. "I hope so." She smiled slightly. "You used to answer every question with 3 words." He looked thoughtful. 3, sometimes 2. A small laugh escaped him, a real one, Evelyn noticed. She had heard Caleb laugh before, but rarely, and never like this. They stopped near the old wooden bridge outside town. Below them, the creek moved slowly over the stones. Caleb looked toward the mountains. "Mercer Ranch is still fighting." Evelyn nodded. "Thomas Grady?" "Yes. Do you have a chance?" Caleb looked at her. "I do now." She understood what he meant. Not because she had the answers, because he was no longer standing alone. The following morning, Evelyn packed her suitcase, the same suitcase she had carried from Kansas, the same one she had held at the Red Hollow station while strangers watched her wait. Caleb stood near the doorway. "You don't have to come back if you're not ready." She looked at him. "I know," a small smile touched her face, "but I am not going back because you need help." She picked up the suitcase. "I'm going back because I choose to." Caleb nodded, and for once he did not try to say more. The journey back to Red Hollow took 2 days. The mountains grew larger with every mile. The familiar roads appeared again, the same valleys, the same forests. But Evelyn felt different arriving this time. Before, she had come west hoping someone would accept her. Now she was returning because she knew her own worth. When Mercer Ranch came into view, Caleb slowed the wagon. The old gate stood exactly where she remembered. The house looked the same, the barn, the fields, the mountains beyond. But something had changed. The door opened before they reached the porch. Samuel stepped outside. For a moment, the older cowboy simply stared, then he smiled. "About time." Evelyn laughed softly. Caleb looked at him. "Samuel," the ranch hand lifted both hands. "I didn't say anything. You were thinking it. That too." For the first time in weeks, the ranch felt alive again. That evening, Evelyn unpacked her things, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she had chosen to return. Caleb stood in the doorway watching her place her books on the shelf. He hesitated. Then he said, "Evelyn." She turned. "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what?" He glanced around the room. "For giving me another chance to build something better." Her expression softened. "This time, Caleb." She paused. "We build it together." He nodded, and outside, beyond the windows of Mercer Ranch, the mountains stood quietly beneath the evening sky. The fight was not over. Thomas Grady was still waiting. The legal battle was still coming, but for the first time, Caleb was not facing it like a man protecting something alone. He was facing it like a man protecting something he had finally learned to share. The people of Red Hollow noticed the difference before Caleb ever said a word. They noticed it when Evelyn Hartley rode into town beside him. Not behind him, beside him. The two of them arrived on a cool spring morning, their wagon rolling slowly down the main street while the mountains watched from beyond the valley. A few people stopped outside the general store. A few conversations became quieter. The same town that once whispered about Evelyn now watched her with a different kind of attention. She knew some still doubted her. She knew some were waiting for her to fail. But this time she did not lower her eyes. She simply stepped down from the wagon and walked beside Caleb. Clara Bennett came out of the store with a smile. "I was wondering when you two would return." Evelyn smiled. "It's good to see you, Clara." Clara looked between them, then she nodded. "Looks like some things finally found their way." Caleb adjusted his hat. "We have work to do." Clara laughed softly. Some things never change. The work began that afternoon. The first thing Caleb and Evelyn did was not confront Thomas Grady. It was organize. They gathered every document they had, the old ranch papers, the supply receipts, the notes Evelyn had made, the records of missing feed shipments, the dates of damaged fences. The information was spread across the kitchen table at Mercer Ranch. For the first time, Caleb did not sit at the head of the table alone. He sat beside Evelyn. They worked late into the night. The lamp burned low. Coffee went cold in their mugs. Papers covered nearly every inch of the wooden surface. Samuel watched from the doorway one evening. He smiled slightly. "Never thought I'd see the day." Caleb looked up. "See what?" The Mercer kitchen looking like a courtroom. Evelyn laughed. Samuel shook his head. "But I suppose it takes more than a good horse and a strong fence to protect a ranch." Caleb glanced at Evelyn. "Sometimes it takes someone who notices what everyone else ignores." Evelyn looked down at the papers. She did not answer, but the small smile on her face said enough. 3 days later, Caleb and Evelyn rode into town for the hearing. The small courthouse sat near the center of Red Hollow. The wooden building had seen years of arguments, land disputes, business disagreements, family matters. But this case had drawn more attention than most. Thomas Grady arrived wearing a dark coat and polished boots. He stepped onto the courthouse steps with confidence, the kind of confidence that came from believing money could solve almost anything. When he saw Evelyn beside Caleb, his expression changed slightly. "Mrs. Mercer," Evelyn looked at him. "Mr. Grady." His smile was thin. "I suppose you decided to stay after all." Caleb stepped forward, but Evelyn gently touched his arm, a small gesture, a reminder, "Not alone." She answered before he could. "I decided where I belong." Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he walked inside. The hearing began shortly after. Thomas's lawyer presented the claim. They argued that the original land records were unclear. They questioned the boundaries. They suggested Caleb had benefited from an old mistake. Caleb sat quietly, listening. Before, he would have been fighting every word, every accusation. But now he waited, because he knew they had something stronger. When it was their turn, Evelyn placed the documents on the table. The lawyer looked through them, then looked at her. "Mrs. Mercer, where did you obtain these notes?" Evelyn answered calmly. "I recorded them while working on the ranch. You are not a surveyor. No, you are not a lawyer." "No." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Then why should this court consider your observations?" The room became quiet. Evelyn looked towards Caleb, then back at the lawyer. "Because I was there." Her voice remained steady. "I saw what changed. I saw what was damaged. I kept records because I believed small things mattered." She placed another paper forward, and because I found a pattern, the lawyer examined it. The room shifted. The documents showed dates, deliveries, repairs, locations. Enough small details connected together to reveal something larger. Clara Bennett was called next. She explained the questions Thomas had asked around town. Samuel confirmed the unusual problems that had affected the ranch. Then came the final piece, a receipt from a supply company, one that showed replacement materials had been purchased under a false order connected to someone working with Grady. The room grew silent. Thomas looked toward his lawyer. For the first time, his confidence disappeared. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. No one spoke. The only sound was the old clock on the wall. After several long minutes, the decision came. The land claim was denied. The water rights remained with Mercer Ranch. The room slowly filled with whispers, but this time, the whispers were different. Outside the courthouse, people gathered, the same people who had once watched Evelyn arrive alone at the station. Now they watched her stand beside Caleb, not as the abandoned bride, not as the woman nobody wanted, as the person who helped save the ranch. Thomas Grady stepped outside last. He looked at Caleb, then at Evelyn. "You got lucky." Caleb said nothing. Evelyn did. She looked at the courthouse behind them. We paid attention. Thomas had no answer. He walked away. That evening, Mercer Ranch felt different. The work was not finished. There would always be repairs. There would always be hard seasons. But something important had changed. The ranch was no longer just Caleb's burden. It was their home. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Caleb and Evelyn stood near the old fence line, the same place where she had once worked alone, trying to prove she belonged. Caleb rested his hands on the fence post. "I should have trusted you sooner." Evelyn looked at him. "Yes," he smiled slightly. She smiled too. A few moments passed, then Caleb said, "I spent years thinking strength meant carrying everything myself." He looked across the valley. "I was wrong." Evelyn stood beside him. Neither of them needed to say more, because some promises were not spoken, they were built. One repaired fence, one shared decision, one ordinary day at a time, and in the valley below the mountains, everyone in Red Hollow finally understood something Caleb had learned the hard way. The woman they thought she had come west, needing a home, had been the person who helped create one. Years passed quietly at Mercer Ranch. Not the kind of quiet Caleb Mercer once knew. Not the empty silence of a house where one man ate alone and carried every burden himself. This was the quiet of a place that had finally found its balance. The sound of morning chores, the creak of the barn doors opening before sunrise, the distant call of cattle moving across the valley, the warm smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen while the first light touched the mountains. Life had changed, not all at once, not in some grand moment, but in thousands of small ones. A repaired fence, a shared decision, a conversation at the end of a long day. That was how Mercer Ranch became what it was, not just because of the land, because of the people who cared for it. Evelyn Hartley Mercer became known throughout Red Hollow as one of the finest ranch women in the valley. The same people who once whispered when she stood alone at the stage station now came to her for advice. A young farmer might stop by asking about winter crops. A rancher might ask how she kept cattle healthy through difficult seasons. A neighbor might bring a broken tool and leave with a repaired plan instead. Evelyn always made time. She remembered what it felt like to arrive somewhere and feel like nobody saw her. She never wanted anyone else to feel that way. One afternoon, Clara Bennett visited the ranch carrying a basket from the general store. She stepped onto the porch and looked across the fields. "Hard to believe this is the same place," Evelyn smiled as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. "What do you mean?" Clara looked toward the barn. Years ago, Caleb Mercer had the strongest ranch in the valley. She accepted the coffee, but it always felt like nobody lived here. Evelyn looked through the window. Inside, Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing ranch records, not alone. Samuel was there too, arguing about fence repairs. The sound of their voices carried outside. Evelyn smiled. "He's changed." Clara nodded. "So have you." Evelyn looked down at her hands. The years had left their marks. The hands that once arrived from Kansas holding a small suitcase now carried the signs of a life built through hard work. "I think we both just needed someone to remind us we didn't have to do everything alone." Clara lifted her cup. "That sounds about right." The years also brought changes to the Mercer family. Daniel Mercer stayed. For the first time in years, the brothers repaired what had been broken between them. They did not forget the past. They simply stopped letting it control the future. Daniel helped expand the ranch operation. Samuel eventually admitted that Evelyn had become the best judge of cattle on the property, though he would never admit it without adding a complaint afterward. "I still say she asks too many questions," he would say. Then he would quietly follow every suggestion she made. Caleb noticed. He noticed everything now. That was one of the biggest differences. He no longer looked only for problems. He looked for moments. One evening, many years after Evelyn first arrived in Red Hollow, Caleb sat beside her on the porch. The mountains stretched across the horizon, the same mountains that had surrounded them through every season. The same mountains that had witnessed loneliness, fear, loss, and eventually, love. Caleb held 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Evelyn. She smiled. "You still remember how I like it." He looked at her. After all these years, a small smile crossed his face. That would be a poor habit to lose. She laughed softly. For a while, they simply watched the valley. No urgent repairs, no legal battles, no threats, just the evening air moving through the trees. Finally, Caleb spoke. "You remember the first day you came here?" Evelyn looked at him. "The day I stood at the station." He nodded. "I remember." She smiled slightly. "I thought my life was over." Caleb looked down at his hands. "I thought I was offering you a place to stay." He paused. "But you were offering me something I didn't even know I needed." Evelyn looked at him. "What was that?" He met her eyes. "A reason to stop living like I was already alone." The porch became quiet. The good kind. The kind they had learned to share. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "I never expected to find this." Caleb looked around. "The ranch?" She shook her head. "No." She looked at him. "Home." The word stayed there. Simple, but it carried everything. The years before, the difficult beginnings, the storm, the separation, the journey back, the choice they made. Home had never been the house. It had never been the land. It had never been the mountains or the fences or the cattle. Home was the person who stood beside you when life became difficult. The person who stayed when leaving would have been easier. The person who saw your worth before the world did. As the sun disappeared behind the peaks, Caleb reached for Evelyn's hand. A small gesture, the same kind of gesture he had made years earlier when he did not know what to say. But now there was no distance between them, no fear, no walls, just 2 people who had found each other in the middle of a life neither one expected. The next morning, Red Hollow woke as it always did. The general store opened. The horses moved through town. The ranches began their daily work. And at the top of the valley, Mercer Ranch stood strong. Not because it had the best land, not because it had the most cattle, but because it had something more valuable. A story, a reminder that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person who brings the greatest strength. That sometimes the person who arrives feeling unwanted becomes the heart of a family. And sometimes, the cowboy who believes he needs nobody discovers that the greatest thing he can build is not a ranch, It is a life shared with someone who chooses to stand beside him. For Caleb Mercer and Evelyn Hartley, that was the truth they spent the rest of their lives proving. They did not simply find a home, they chose one. Together. They chose one. Together. And maybe that was the greatest victory Caleb and Evelyn ever found. Not the land, not the ranch, not the respect of a town that once judged them too quickly. It was the quiet understanding that two wounded people could meet in the middle of a hard world and still build something beautiful. Imagine standing where Evelyn stood that cold day in Red Hollow, holding a small suitcase, surrounded by strangers who had already decided your story before knowing your heart. Imagine wondering if you had traveled all that way only to be turned away. Or imagine being Caleb, a man who spent years believing strength meant carrying every burden alone, only to discover that the person beside him was never a weakness. Their story reminds us that love is not always found in perfect beginnings. Sometimes it arrives through patience, forgiveness, and the courage to let someone truly see you. A second chance can become a new life when two people choose honesty over fear and partnership over pride. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Evelyn's place? And if you enjoy stories of unexpected love, healing, and the strength of the human spirit, consider subscribing. Many more unforgettable journeys, hidden truths, and heartfelt tales are waiting for you in the stories ahead.